The world did not expect this. Not from a landlocked country of barely 20 million people, not from a nation so often dismissed as one of Africa's poorest. Yet, in the dusty heart of Ouagadougou, history shifted not with an explosion, but with a sentence. A single voice cut through decades of silence and submission, echoing beyond the Sahel, across the Atlantic, and into the very halls of Washington. I have ordered the CIA to leave Burkina Faso. End of prayer. Those words, calm, deliberate, unwavering, rippled through the world like a shockwave disguised as a whisper. In an era when small nations often speak through the vocabulary of fear, Ibrahim Traoré chose the language of defiance. And at that moment, the myths that had long defined Africa began to tremble. For years, the illusion of partnership cloaked a hidden truth. Beneath the banners of security cooperation and strategic aid, quiet shadows had settled across African soil. Bases were built, data collected, governments persuaded, and sovereignty bit by bit outsourced. Billions of dollars moved under the name of stability, yet villages just kilometers away from those bases remained without running water, schools flickered in darkness, and hospitals ran out of medicine before dawn. It was a paradox so vast that it had become invisible, until one soldier decided to see it. Ibrahim Traoré, once a captain, now a symbol of defiance, did not rise from comfort. He came from the dust, from the ranks of a generation raised under the weight of dependency. His rise was not born from luxury or political inheritance, it was born from fatigue. The fatigue of watching a continent rich in gold and uranium, yet poor in autonomy. The fatigue of signing agreements written in someone else's language. The fatigue of leaders shaking hands in Paris, Brussels, or Washington, while the fields of the Sahel grew emptier each year. And when fatigue turns to clarity, clarity becomes courage. In the early months of 2025, that courage took form. Traoré stood before his council, not with grand speeches or fiery rhetoric, but with evidence, maps, documents, photographs showing what lay hidden behind the barbed wire fences of cooperation. Advanced listening devices, satellite receivers, encrypted servers, all pointing inward, not outward. The eyes of a superpower fixed not on its enemies, but on its supposed allies. It was not the first time Africa had seen this pattern. From the Cold War to the War on Terror, the continent had long been treated as a chessboard where foreign hands moved pieces under the pretext of protection. France called it Francafrique. The United States called it counterterrorism. But to those who lived under the watch of these unseen towers, it all felt the same control repackaged as cooperation. Still, few dared to question it. After all, who challenges an empire without consequence? Who risks the wrath of the most powerful intelligence network on Earth? Only those who have already known hunger, betrayal, and fear, and learned that dignity is the last resource no one can steal. And so, on that quiet morning in Ouagadougou, Traoré made his choice. He did not whisper it behind diplomatic curtains. He did not beg for negotiation or delay. He spoke it openly, before cameras, before citizens, before the world. The CIA has 48 hours to leave our soil. For a moment, silence followed. The kind of silence that exists between disbelief and awakening. Then murmurs. Then thunder. Some called him reckless. Others called him revolutionary. Washington called it a breach of partnership. But in the streets of Ouagadougou, in the classrooms of Bobo Dioulasso, in the dusty markets of Kaya, people called it something else entirely, freedom spoken aloud, because this was more than a diplomatic dispute. It was an act of self-definition. For decades, Africa's story had been written in the ink of others. Its leaders often played supporting roles in scripts crafted in Western capitals. But now, a new narrative had emerged, one authored in the Sahel, by those who refused to remain characters in someone else's plot. The symbolism was undeniable. A young African leader, standing barehanded before the machinery of empire, saying no, not in private, but in public, before his people. It was as if the ghost of Thomas Sankara had returned, not in body, but in spirit, a reminder that courage, like oppression, can be contagious. And that contagion began to spread. Across the continent, whispers turned to questions. If Burkina Faso could send the CIA home, what of Niger? What of Mali, Chad, or Ghana? What of the entire Sahel, once divided by colonial lines, but now united by a shared fatigue with dependency? Even beyond Africa, observers felt the tremor. Western analysts warned of instability, of danger, of loss. But beneath those headlines, another narrative was being born, a narrative of awakening. Because when one small nation dares to defy a superpower, the world is forced to reconsider the scale of strength. Burkina Faso's GDP barely touches $20 billion, a fraction of what Washington spends on defense in a week. Yet, in that equation of power, a paradox unfolded. For in matters of dignity, size becomes irrelevant. Sovereignty does not depend on numbers, but on will. And so, the question emerged heavy and inevitable. What happens when a people long silenced begin to speak? The answer is never immediate. It begins slowly in the eyes of students who look at their flag differently, in the voice of elders who remember what independence once meant, in the courage of a leader who chooses risk over obedience. That is what the world witnessed in early 2025. Not a rebellion, not a coup, not an accident, but a declaration. A line drawn in red earth and courage. Burkina Faso will not be managed from the shadows anymore. The air in Ouagadougou that morning was thick with uncertainty. Journalists whispered about sanctions, diplomats spoke of isolation, and investors watched with unease. Yet, in the hearts of ordinary citizens, something rare was stirring belief. Belief that for once, a leader had chosen dignity over diplomacy. That for once, sovereignty was not just a word in textbooks, but a living, breathing truth. Perhaps this is what revolutions look like in the 21st century, not the roar of guns, but the firmness of words. Not chaos in the streets, but calm in the face of empire. The world had seen Africa rise and fall, promise and despair, hope and betrayal. But this time felt different. Because this time, the declaration did not come from the corridors of aid agencies or the podiums of summits. It came from the soil itself. From a place that had endured exploitation and yet still dared to say, enough. History does not always change in noise. Sometimes it shifts in silence in the moment. A young captain signs a decree. In the instant, a flag is raised over reclaimed land, in the breath between fear and resolve. And so the silence broke, not with violence, but with conviction. Not to destroy, but to reclaim. Burkina Faso's ultimatum to the United States was not just a political act, it was a mirror held to the entire world, a mirror asking a question long avoided. If sovereignty means obedience, is it still sovereignty? And if freedom requires permission, is it still freedom? The story begins there in that fragile space between courage and consequence, where a young African leader defied a superpower, not with armies or threats, but with truth. And as the dust settled over the Sahel, the world watched, wondering not if Traoré would fall, but if his courage would spread. Because sometimes the smallest nations remind us of the greatest truths, that dignity is not negotiated, sovereignty is not borrowed, and silence once broken can never be restored. For decades, Africa's struggle has not only been about resources stolen or aid manipulated. It has been about the right to decide without foreign shadow. And now in 2025, one small nation has dared to turn that right into reality. The world is watching. Some predict chaos, others predict transformation. But the deeper question lingers: if Burkina Faso can demand the departure of a foreign intelligence base openly and without apology, what might happen if an entire continent found the courage to do the same? History does not always turn with explosions. Sometimes it shifts in silence. The withdrawal of the CIA from Burkina Faso was one such moment. No shots, no last-minute standoffs, only a quiet departure that spoke louder than any battle could. On the first day, convoys of black SUVs rolled out under heavy secrecy. Helicopters lifted equipment into the Sahel sky. Computers, satellite dishes, crates marked with codes only intelligence officers could understand. These were not trophies of cooperation, but symbols of an era ending. Billions of US dollars had been invested globally in such security operations. Yet in Burkina Faso, the return was fences, suspicion, and secrecy. Could this really be called partnership? By the second day, the once guarded gates of the compound stood deserted. The buzzing of drones ceased, the checkpoints vanished, and the soldiers who once patrolled in foreign uniforms were gone. A base that once seemed untouchable now looked abandoned. It's silence, a testimony to the will of a sovereign people. International observers admitted with surprise, for the first time, a U.S. intelligence hub was dismantled in Africa without resistance. And then came the reaction at home. Crowds gathered outside, not in anger, but in relief. Some cried, others sang, many waved the national flag. To them, sovereignty was no longer an abstract idea taught in classrooms. It was visible in the empty compound in the reclaimed land, in the sense that their country was once again their own. For farmers, traders, and students, this was a living proof that a nation's dignity cannot be measured in aid, dollars, but in decisions made without permission. The symbolism was powerful. The CIA left without firing a single shot, without the authority to stay a single hour beyond the ultimatum. And the world was watching. Commentators called it humiliating. Others called it historic. But for Burkina Faso, it was something simpler and deeper. Freedom made real. But the question now grows larger. If one of the world's most secretive agencies can be compelled to leave in broad daylight, what does this mean for the rest of Africa? Is this the dawn of a new era where foreign bases fall silent one after another, replaced by voices of nations that finally refuse to be managed from the shadows? Sometimes the most powerful battles are not fought with weapons, but with documents. When the CIA compound in Burkina Faso finally stood empty, the silence revealed something even more explosive than its presence. A trove of data left behind, a library of surveillance that shook not just Ouagadougou, but the entire African continent. Inside the deserted halls, investigators uncovered racks of servers humming with stored information. Hard drives contain high-resolution geological maps of Burkina Faso's gold, mines, uranium fields, and manganese. Deposits, resources worth billions of US dollars on global markets. What was presented as security cooperation was in truth a mining of information that could dictate the future of African economies. Alongside these maps were doses of Birkin-based citizens, files with names, addresses, and records of those considered anti-American. These were not criminals in any legal sense, but teachers, activists, journalists, and even parliamentarians who had spoken against foreign interference. Was this security or a quiet attempt to control a nation's political soul? Even more disturbing were the networks of surveillance equipment discovered. A phone interception system covered the Sahel region, capable of monitoring tens of thousands of calls daily. Data logs revealed conversations from Mali, Niger, and even Sahel. It was not just Burkina Faso under the microscope, but an entire subcontinent. In financial terms, experts estimated that the infrastructure left behind represented investments of over $500 million. A reminder that Africa's sovereignty had been measured in dollars spent to monitor rather than to build. Faced with this evidence, Traoré made a choice few leaders would dare. He ordered the documents declassified and released to the public. Screens in Ouagadougou's National Assembly lit up with images of confiscated servers, leaked transcripts, and maps stamped with the CIA seals. Within hours, the data spread across Africa's media space. What had been whispered in rumors was now undeniable fact. The Sahel was not only a battleground of insurgency, but also of silent intelligence wars. The shock waves were immediate. In Bamako, demonstrators marched with signs demanding their government inspect every foreign base on Malian soil. In Niamey, parliamentarians filed motions to summon ministers for questioning about hidden agreements. In Dar and Abidjan, civil society groups began petitions for full transparency in defense contracts. And in Addis Ababa, the African Union, often criticized for its cautious tone, was forced to issue a statement calling for an independent investigation into foreign surveillance across member states. Could a continental body remain silent when evidence now sat in plain sight? Western media outlets scrambled to contain the narrative. Some downplayed the revelations as routine intelligence. Others accused Burkina Faso of fabricating the scale of the files, but the sheer detail, satellite coordinates, audio logs, and internal memos made the Nile nearly impossible. African economists highlighted a painful irony. While billions were spent spying on Africa, the continent still received only fragmented aid for infrastructure. How many roads, schools, or hospitals could 500 million have built if invested in development instead of digital? Fences for the Burkinabe people. The moment was transformative. What once seemed like conspiracy now stood as fact. Market vendors discussed it while weighing grain. Students debated it in classrooms, and elders invoked it as proof that vigilance must be eternal. Sovereignty was no longer just about who controlled the land, but also who controlled the flow of information. And so the scene closes with a haunting question. If one base in Burkina Faso could harbor so much evidence of manipulation, how many other silent archives lie waiting beneath the soil of Africa, unseen, unchallenged, and still shaping the destiny of nations? The retaliation was swift. Washington announced the suspension of aid programs, the freezing of educational exchanges, and the withdrawal of its remaining advisors. For a nation with a GDP of barely $20 billion, losing U.S. assistance valued at over $100 million annually might have looked like a devastating blow. The headlines in Western media predicted isolation, collapse, and regret. But reality took a different turn. Almost immediately, new doors opened. Ghana and Nigeria stepped forward with pledges of bilateral support, offering trade agreements and technical cooperation. The African Development Bank announced emergency financing packages with hundreds of millions of US dollars, specifically aimed at stabilizing the Sahel economies. Instead of isolation, Burkina Faso found itself embraced by regional solidarity. What was meant as punishment became a badge of honor, a sign that one small nation could stand its ground against the strongest power and not be left alone. For ordinary Burkinabe citizens, the message was powerful. Sovereignty comes at a price, but it also earns respect. And for Africa, a deeper question now lingers. If sanctions intended to divide can instead unite, what happens when more nations begin to resist the same chains? What began in Ouagadougou did not stop at Burkina Faso's borders. It sparked a chain reaction across the continent. In name, Niger's parliament opened hearings on the presence of Western military bases, questioning contracts that had long been signed in secrecy. In N'Djamena, Chad's leaders announced a review of all foreign agreements tied to intelligence and security. And whispers in Dakar, Kala, and even Lusaka began to circulate. If Burkina Faso can reclaim control, why not us? The ripples soon reached Addis Ababa. The African Union, often accused of caution, introduced a draft framework that would for the first time set legal limits on foreign intelligence operations across member states. Such a move carries not only political weight, but financial stakes. U.S. defense operations in Africa are valued in the billions of dollars annually. To see those investments questioned, shakes the very foundation of Washington's influence. The symbolism is undeniable. One small Sahel nation forcing a superpower to retreat has emboldened others to demand transparency. But the deeper question rises. If the dominoes continue to fall, will Africa move from fragmented acts of defiance to a united strategy of sovereignty that no outside power can easily undo? Victory in politics, as in life, never comes free of charge. Burkina Faso's bold decision to expel the CIA base carried consequences that quickly rippled through its fragile economy. Aid programs were frozen, delaying construction of schools and clinics. Hospitals that once depended on medical supply contracts faced slowdowns, and some infrastructure projects worth tens of millions of US dollars suddenly lost their foreign sponsors. In a nation where annual budgets barely exceed $5 billion, every suspended contract was felt like a stone dropped into a small pond, the waves touching every household. But Traoré never promised comfort. He promised dignity. And dignity, as he told his people, is a currency worth more than grants that arrive with hidden conditions. The price of sovereignty included hardship, but it also awakened something more powerful: trust. The Burkinabe people began to see that their leader would rather endure influence in the region than sell
Moscow has finally authorized a nuclear deal with.
Was this not the very definition of national pride? Of course, the struggle did not end there. Political opponents at home accused Traoré of recklessness. Rumors of assassination plots swirled in whispers, echoing Africa's tragic history, where courageous leaders often face the ultimate risk. Yet Traoré's stance remained firm. Help that comes with chains is not help. It is ransom. His defiance turned into a shield of legitimacy, drawing ordinary citizens closer to his side. For the first time in decades, young Burkinabe students spoke openly of independence, not as theory, but as practice. In classrooms, debate shifted from how do we survive with foreign aid to how do we build an economy that stands on its own. Farmers in the countryside spoke of pooling resources. Small traders in Ouagadougou dreamed of national industries. And the diaspora began sending remittances with renewed pride, seeing them not as charity, but as investment. The sense of possibility was palpable. Financial experts note that even a modest redirection of $200 million annually, once tied to external contracts toward domestic projects, could reshape the national landscape. Imagine what that means. New irrigation systems for agriculture, digital infrastructure to connect rural areas, or vocational schools training the next generation of engineers. For a country that produces over $3, $5 billion worth of gold each year, the numbers were not impossible. The question was never about resources. It was about courage. And so the paradox emerges. Yes, Burkina Faso paid a price in the short term, but in return, it gained something priceless: the trust of its people and the vision of a new future where sovereignty is not borrowed but built. The deeper challenge remains: can this spirit of sacrifice and pride endure when the pressure grows heavier? Or will Africa once again see dreams suffocated by comfort sold in the currency of dependency? Symbols matter long after headlines fade and diplomats move on. It is symbols that shape how nations remember their past and imagine their future. The abandoned CIA compound in Ouagadougou could have remained an empty shell, a relic of control. Instead, Traoré shows transformation. With a bold decision, he ordered that the site be rebuilt, not as a fortress of secrecy, but as a center for African youth leadership training. The same walls that once monitored a continent would now host classrooms, debates, and workshops designed to equip a new generation with the tools of independence. Inside, one wing is being prepared as a museum. Visitors will walk through exhibits displaying confiscated servers, photographs of surveillance towers, and documents stamped with foreign seals, not to glorify the past, but to warn this happened here and it can happen again if vigilance fails. School children will visit, scholars will study, and citizens will remember that sovereignty is never given. It is defended. What once symbolized submission will now stand as a monument to defiance. Traoré himself summarized it in words destined to outlive his presidency. I was afraid, but I feared silence more than anything else. That statement resonated far beyond Burkina Faso, reminding Africans that courage is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear dictate history. Financial analysts estimate that converting the site into an educational hub will cost nearly $30 million. A small price compared to the $500 million once invested in using it to control information. But the symbolic return, the empowerment of future leaders, is priceless. This transformation also sends a wider message. Africa need not erase its scars to heal. It can turn them into lessons, shaping narratives of resilience rather than victimhood by reclaiming the very space once used to diminish it. Burkina Faso demonstrates a principle every so-called third world nation can embrace, that sovereignty is not only a political act, but a cultural inheritance. And so the base that once silenced voices will now amplify them. The compound that once mapped Africa's wealth in secret will now cultivate Africa's wealth in people. The shift is not just local, it is continental. But here is the haunting question that remains. If Burkina Faso can convert a symbol of foreign control into a school of African pride, what would happen if every nation across the continent did the same, turning its shadows into beacons for the generations to come? The expulsion of the CIA from Burkina Faso will be remembered not only as a political decision, but as a turning point in history. News does. But its echo will remain in classrooms, in the songs of farmers, in the quiet pride of a generation that can finally say, we are the authors now. And perhaps that is the greatest victory of all. Because sovereignty is not a destination, it is a discipline. It is the daily act of choosing truth over comfort, self-respect over assistance, courage over silence. Burkina Faso's story reminds us that revolutions do not need violence to be powerful. They need conviction. They need a leader unafraid to speak when others whisper. And above all, they need people willing to carry that conviction beyond the moment of applause into work, into sacrifice, into the slow building of a nation that depends not on permission, but on principle. That is the meaning of the School of Freedom. A generation from now, when a child in Ouagadougou walks through those same gates, they will not see walls of secrecy. They will see classrooms filled with light, teachers explaining what once stood there and why it must never stand again. And perhaps that child will smile, not out of pride alone, but out of understanding that freedom, once claimed, must be taught, protected, and renewed. The story then does not end, it continues. In every African city that still hosts a foreign flag over local soil, in every young voice that questions why not us, in every decision to replace dependence with dignity, the question that began in Burkina Faso now belongs to all of us. If one nation can stand and say no, what happens when an entire continent stands together and says never again? That is the question Africa must answer and the world must face. Because today, the myth of invincibility has fallen. The illusion of control has cracked. And in the dust of the Sahel, a new dawn has begun, one written not by empires, but by the hands of those once forgotten. So when future historians ask where the second liberation of Africa began, they will not look to Washington, Paris, or Brussels. They will look to a quiet morning in Ouagadougou, when a young soldier looked beyond fear and simply said, enough. And that, my friends, is where history turned not through conquest, but through conviction. If you have watched until this moment, then you already understand that this story is not about one man or one country. It is about us, the people who still believe that knowledge is a weapon, that truth is resistance, and that silence is surrender. So before you leave, take a moment. Reflect on what this means, not for politicians, but for citizens. For every African child growing up under the shadow of another's flag. For every nation told to wait its turn. For every soul that still doubts the power of standing tall. Because in the end, freedom is not won once it is chosen every day. And now, I ask you, if this story spoke to you, if it stirred something within you, do not let it fade when the screen goes dark. Be part of the voice that keeps it alive. Subscribe to this channel, Africa Libre, and join a movement of minds committed to truth, courage, and sovereignty. Share the story with those who still believe Africa's destiny is written elsewhere. Because the more voices rise, the harder it becomes to silence them again. We are not an audience, we are witnesses to a turning point. And as history unfolds, let us not just watch it, let us write it. The silence has ended. The struggle continues, and the future belongs to those who dare to speak.